Cafe Luna, Seasons of Adventure, Volume 1, by Lux Lucerne. Chapter 6. Snowflakes fluttering in the wind, trees rustling as they sway with each gust, Lunadia sat on the bench with her furry companion. They were both quite full, though the warmth of the meal was starting to wear off, as the gray clouds grew darker and the light of the sun turned dim, devoid of energy. "I better get going and finish shopping before the storm blows in," whispered Lunadia. She looked down at the cat still curled in her lap. It was resting quietly and looked quite comfortable. She pet him, brushing his plush fur, and forced a smile which did not reach her eyes. "I have to go now, okay, little Fluffy? I don't know if I'll be able to take care of you. There's a lot going on for me right now," she whispered with sorrow. "You've got somewhere to go home to, right? You must have. You look so fat and fluffy." She stopped petting him and gently shifted him off from her lap. She leaned her hands on her lap and tensed her shoulders as she thought. The cat stirred from his slumber for a moment, and placed a paw on her hand before going back to sleep, nuzzling his head against her thigh. She placed her other hand on his paw and felt it. The pads on the bottom of his feet were a bit cold, but felt supple and smooth. The fur on his paws was soft and warm. He's a soft and gentle cat, she thought. But with quiet dexterity, she moved his paw onto the bench and walked away. She walked away from the bench and left the cat there. She gripped her cloak and held it tightly, wrapping her arms around herself. She left without intent of looking back. Her shoes made a steady clopping sound upon the stone walkway. She couldn't take care of a cat. She could barely take care of herself right now. He must have a home. Who could abandon such a wonderful cat? The sound of her steps grew quieter, eventually reaching a stop, and she bit her lip. She turned around to look at the cat, feeling unsure and confused. The cat had begun to stir, and upon opening his eyes, he did not find his savior sitting next to him. He looked around. "Meow," said the cat, tilting his head in confusion. He sniffed the bench where Lunadia had sat, then looked outward. "Meow," he cried. The cat called out, unsure of where she had gone. He sounded pitiful, like a small baby. He hopped down from the bench and sniffed around, calling out again and again. "Meow, meow, meow, meow," cried the cat again and again, pitiful and small, lost to the wind. Lunadia's heart began to ache. What if he doesn't have anywhere to go? What if he really was abandoned? She was hurting on the inside and worried about everything in the world. She could not help but to help those in need. That big ball of fluff was in need. The young woman began to walk back towards the bench where the cat was sniffing around. Her face relaxed. She let go of her cloak, letting it trail behind her in the cold wind. The shiny buckles on her shoes jingled, and the soles clopped on the stone. She walked back to the cat. Upon hearing the sound of her shoes, the cat looked in her direction and rushed to her side, at first moving like an excited wooden rocking horse with fluffy legs, then transitioned into small little steps. She knelt down and he nuzzled his head against her legs. He let out an excited greeting, then started to purr. "Meow," said the cat with joy. "I guess you're my cat now, huh?" Nadia whispered. "You must really like me." She rustled the top of his head. She lowered her head and closed her eyes. Her silver hair fell forward and cradled her face. A small smile shone through. She took a deep breath and relaxed. "That's that, then. You're officially my little fluffy friend," she announced with excitement. "I think I shall call you Luffy." Meow, said Luffy with joy, as if in agreement. Lunadia scooped him up from under his arms and held him to her chest, wrapping her cloak around the both of them. His head and front paws stuck out from the top, and his tail wiggled in the breeze below. Let's go pick up some ingredients before we head back. I'm gonna make something yummy for dinner, said Lunadia. Luffy looked around with his big, bright eyes as he walked the quiet side markets of Port Italy. They entered a grocery store, finding a relief from the wind, and perused the produce. What kind of veggies do you think I should get, Luffy? They have a lot of root veggies this time of year. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, carrots, turnips, said Lunadia, looking around the store. Could always get something that's imported, too. Oh, I always like to use what's in season. It's less expensive and packed full of flavor. What do you think, little Fluffy? Lunadia walked over to each basin of vegetables, letting Luffy have a look at them. Luffy's ears were upright and alert as he investigated them with bright eyes and soft nose. He did not budge for the potatoes, did not budge for the turnips. He was neither interested in the leafy greens nor the colorful squashes. But when they arrived at the carrots, Luffy raised up a paw from Lunadia's cloak and in a downward swipe placed it on a fresh-looking carrot. "Ow!" he exclaimed. "Do you like carrots, Luffy?" asked Lunadia, tilting her head. "The one you picked out looks pretty good." Lunadia picked up the carrot and held it in front of Luffy. He wiggled out his other arm from under the cloak and held the carrot to his chest, looking quite content. "Let's get a bunch of them, and some sweet potatoes too. I think that would go well together," said Lunadia. Lunadia got a couple bags and filled them with carrots and sweet potatoes, with Luffy guiding her with his nose, letting out the occasional meow. He also ordered some lean ground beef from the butcher, which Luffy sniffed with interest and curiosity. Content with her findings, Lunadia took out her coin purse from her bag and parted with some of the few bits of money she had left. But with all these ingredients to carry, Lunadia had to put Luffy down on the floor. She took out his carrot and placed it in a small bag and tied it to his back. Luffy was confused at first, wiggling around wondering what was on his back, but after sniffing the bag and finding his carrot of choice, he was content with the arrangement. So as they went out the door, they were greeted by a wind colder and more fierce than earlier. Both of them shivered in the wind, and Luffy looked up at Lunadia with big eyes. He huddled down and puffed up his fur, looking quite pitiful and fluffy. "Meow!" Luffy cried. "Brr, a winter storm is definitely blowing in," said Lunadia, shivering. "What am I going to do with you? You look so sad." She let out a sigh and placed her groceries on the floor for a moment. I guess I can carry you in my bag," she said, with narrowed eyes, analyzing him. "I don't know if you're going to fit, though. You're kind of big." She shrugged and knelt down next to him, bringing around her bag and holding it open for him. He sniffed it inquisitively and put his head into it. "Meow," said Luffy. He stood there confused, head in the bag, tail fluttering in the wind. "Oh my gosh, such a little simple cat," Lunadia said, laughing. "I'll help you." She picked him up by his rear and placed his bottom into the bag. Once he realized what was going on, he let out a meow and ducked his head down into the bag, with his ears poking out of the top. The bag felt quite plump and full, though he managed to fit into it quite comfortably. Lunadia hefted the bag over her shoulder with care, and then picked up her grocery bags. "All right, let's go back to your new home, Luffy," said Lunadia, smiling. "I think you'll like it very much." The storm was getting stronger, with biting cold wind and flecks of snow swirling around, stinging like a hail of arrows. It howled through the alleyways, endless mournful cries, as the clouds grew darker and the snow heavier. The outer market seemed devoid of people, and as Lunadia approached the center market, people were making their way out and shops started to close. Those that remained were adventurers making last-minute drop-offs to repair shops and scrabbling to pick up supplies. In particular, Lunadia noticed a pair of adventurers standing at an alchemist's shop. "Excuse me, do you have any potions or recovery items left?" said an elegant young woman with an air of courtesy and grace. "My companion and I have been questing in the mountains, and the situation there has been worsening." "Oh, I'm sorry, but I don't have any stock left. The whole city is sold out on medical supplies and consumable items," said the shopkeeper, shaking their head. "Everyone is up in a frenzy with that new plague sweeping through Plutuvia. I'm closing up shop now. You two better get indoors before the storm hits in full force." "That is unfortunate. Thank you for your time. Farewell," the woman said, with a nod. She turned to her companion and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let us return to the inn for the time being. I'm sure you're getting cold." The two adventurers began to leave, but Lunadia trotted up to them and tapped the elegant woman on the shoulder. "Excuse me, my name is Lunadia," said Lunadia. "I overheard you were looking for recovery items. I might know where to get some if you could tell me more about what you need." The two adventurers turned around. The first was a young woman adorned with long flowing black hair with a red bow in the back. She wore a purple and black kimono dress that gave off an air of youth and confidence, and had a katana at her hip. Her presence was like that of a tree, stern and steady, with the grace and elegance of blossoming branches. The second appeared to be her junior, with brunette hair that framed her youthful face. She wore a black blouse with a high-waisted crimson skirt, and had a large-rimmed witch's hat, with which she hid under. This one appeared quite meek in comparison, standing as if she was peering from behind a tree like a lost lamb. She held in her hand a staff with a crimson gem at the top. "Oh, any help you could provide would be much appreciated," the woman replied with a smile. "I am Julie, and this is my companion, Lisette." "Pleasure to meet you," said Lunadia, giving them both a smile and a nod each. Lisette nodded her head and waved meekly as she stood close behind Julie. "We've just come back from the Hoarfrost Mountains. The region has been experiencing many snowstorms, and it's been bitter cold. There's that ailment that's been going around too," Julie recounted. Lunadia maintained eye contact and focused on listening. She nodded and had a calm seriousness to her. "Nobody I've talked to has been able to identify it, but I've heard it has similar effects as an undead's vitality draining. A lot of the common folk have been affected, and it's," said Julie before pausing. She averted her gaze and shook her head. It was like the light in their eyes had gone out. They were still alive and functioning, but they seemed empty on the inside. "Anything you could do to help would be much appreciated." Lunadia placed a hand on her cheek and thought for a moment. By this point, Luffy had poked his head out from the bag and let out a curious mew. Lisette's eyes opened wide as she looked at the cat with a small smile. She stood there without speaking a word, but had a twinkle in her eyes. "Goodness me. Quite worrisome, isn't it? Well, for the cold at least, you can find fire herb in Crystal Front Forest just outside of town. They grow under large trees and have pointed leaves colored orange and red. They kind of look like little campfires," said Lunadia, gesturing her fingers like wisps of flame. "If you grind them up and boil them in water, they'll make a brew that'll keep you warm for a few hours." "Fire herb. We'll have to keep an eye out for those," Julie said with a nod. Julie turned to Lisette for a moment and gestured, as if she was writing. Lisette pulled out a notebook and made some quick notes, before turning her attention back to Luffy. Lisette turned the page, then shifted her eyes back and forth between Luffy and her notebook, making quick movements with her pencil each time. "For the vitality draining effects, though, you won't be able to find anything easily around here," continued Lunadia. "The herbs are hard to come by and the potions are expensive, even more so now. It would be safer to bring a healer with you." Most troubling. Is there anything else we can do about the vitality draining effects?" "I don't think we'll be able to find a healer to join our party," said Julie. She glanced over towards Lisette, then turned back to Lunadia's gaze with a troubled smile. It's hard to find people with gentle souls. You'll have to be careful then. Those with weaker constitutions are more susceptible, replied Lunania, returning Julie's look with a soft understanding. Lunadia nodded her head towards Lisette for a moment, and was preoccupied with having a staring contest with Luffy. Lisette appeared to have finished with her notebook and was watching Luffy with wonder in her eyes, sparkling with joy. Julie nodded. Other than that, I've heard the ailment is magical in nature, something called a rime plague. Whatever your plans are, avoid the black snow, said Lunadia. She looked at Julie with resolute seriousness. If it's really like dealing with the undead's life-draining effects, as long as you get a good meal and a long rest, the lesser effects will wear off soon enough. I've never dealt with the undead much, so seeing those poor people, said Julie, shaking her head. It's quite worrying. Lunadia put a hand on her shoulder and smiled gently. If you do plan to go looking for herbs in the forest, you may be able to find flowers that look like a silver bell, called Dawn's Bell. If you eat those, you'll keep your senses sharp while you're affected, though they're uncommon, Lunadia continued. And she brushed her hair forward, draping it over her shoulder. She tapped her hair tie. Keep a lookout for flowers that look like this as well. It's called a frosted edelweiss, star-shaped with silver blue petals. They're rare, and mostly found in the mountains, though they're a cure-all. They'll cleanse most magical ailments. Julie turned towards Lisette again and gave her a nod, though she was preoccupied looking at Luffy, holding her notebook to her chest, arms crossed. Julie gave her a slight nudge, then reported what Lunadia had told her. Lisette opened her notebook again and noted it all down. You can find the usual healing herbs all over as well. Good to keep on you with healing potions being scarce right now, said Lunadia with a smile. Oh, I'm sure you're familiar with those. You two seem quite dependable. Julie nodded. An adventurer's best friend out in the wild. As for where to get some good food, Lunadia said, averting her gaze with a sly smile. Then she pointed off into the distance towards the lake district. You two should come by Cafe Luna. I'll treat you to some good food. That'll get you into top condition. Are you a cook or an adventurer? Said Julie, tilting her head in surprise. Hee hee, giggled Lunadia, putting her hands on her hips. She stuck out her chest, puffed up her cheeks, and had a big smile on her face. Both. You can find lots of yummy ingredients traveling around as an adventurer, not to mention all the ideas you get. Like shattering glass, Julie's elegant and noble guard was broken. She bent over with a hand over her belly and let out a laugh. Lisette looked at Julie and smiled, having a small laugh herself. Eventually Julie caught up her breath and righted herself. She had a bright smile on her face and her posture relaxed. That really caught me off guard and tickled me, said Julie. Good. There's plenty more laughs and smiles to be had at Cafe Luna. Rest is just as important as hard work, said Lunadia, crossing her arms and nodding her head. Then she looked at Lisette, leaned over and spoke softly. And you're welcome to play with Luffy. I'm sure he'd enjoy the attention. Lisette looked up to Julie, her eyes twinkling with excitement. She clenched her fist to her chest and nodded. Julie laughed. Then Lisette took out her notebook, flicked through the pages, and turned it towards Lunadia. It was a drawing of Luffy. A bit simple and childish, all full of charm. Ah, such a cute drawing. Luffy is a good boy, isn't he? Said Lunadia, smushing her cheeks. And I actually just rescued him earlier today, and you decided to stay with me. Lisette's eyes widened as she looked at Luffy with sadness. Rescued? Off the street? Lisette asked. Well, yes. I think he had been abandoned, replied Lunadia. Though I had also saved him from some raging barbarian. Julie tilted her head and placed a finger on her cheek. A barbarian? Just a big ignorant man, Lunadia said, shaking her head. He thought Luffy was a monster, so he kicked him away from the stall. Oh no, said Lisette, clutching her hands over her heart and looking at Luffy, her eyes getting wet. He's okay now, though. I healed him and gave him some lunch, said Lunadia. She rustled the top of Luffy's head, and he closed his eyes. pressing up against her while purring softly. Everything's okay now. Lisette nodded and sniffled. I suppose that's a story to share over a hot meal, said Lunadia. She smiled softly at Lisette. Luffy is okay now. I'm going to take good care of him. Julie put a hand on Lisette's shoulder and patted her. Then she smiled at Lunadia. I think we'll take you up on that offer soon. The wind picked up, sending forth a wave of cold. The snow started to fall faster and heavier. They all shivered. Well, for now, I think we'll head back to the inn to figure out what we're going to do next, said Julie, giving Lisette a nod. Okay. It was very nice to meet you. Good luck on your travels, replied Lunadia, with a smile warm enough to ward off the cold. Thank you for showing me your drawing, Lisette. That was very cute. Indeed. It was a pleasure making your acquaintance, Julie said, returning the smile. Maybe we'll have the opportunity to group up sometime and quest together. That'd be nice, said Lunadia. You do need a healer after all. That we do. It'd be comforting to have you supporting us, Julie replied with a laugh. I can fight as well, Lunadia said, puffing up again. She took out her wand with a twirl and conjured her bow of frost. Always better if your healer can look after herself, too. Lisette looked the bow up and down, clenching her fist to her chest, eyes twinkling. She was left breathless by the crystalline bow limbs twinkling in the light. You do seem quite dependable, said Julie. And she put a hand on Lisette's shoulder and smiled. And you could probably tell what Lisette thinks of you already. The wind howled through the market, the snow stinging as it rushed by. They all shivered once again, and Luffy tucked his head into Lunania's bag, only his ears poking out from the top. We should get going. It's quite cold out, Julie said. She bit her lip and averted her gaze. Before we all seek shelter, though, can I ask you something? Of course. What is it? Said Lunania, tilting her head with a soft look in her eyes. Julie stepped in close and whispered into Lunania's ear. Whatever your sources of information are, you seem to know more than the general public, Julie said quietly. I've heard rumors that whatever's going on is caused by an elder calamity. Lunadia placed a steady hand on Julie's shoulder. She turned and looked her in the eye, a weak smile on her face. A storm's coming. Be careful.